So today I wanted to make a less personal and more factual video about other diagnoses that you might confuse with avoidant personality disorder, for if you're wondering if you might have avoidant personality disorder or something else. So if you haven't watched any of my other videos, I'm Jake. I have avoidant personality disorder and social anxiety disorder. I don't have the other disorders that I'm going to be comparing to here. I'm doing it from the perspective of I relate to AvPD, and this is why I don't relate to these other diagnoses. But to be clear, I'm not a psychologist, and I'm not qualified to be a first-party source on anything but the diagnoses that I have. So if you're wondering more specifically about any of these, you shouldn't ask me about say autism or something. Ask me any questions about avoidant personality disorder. If you're wondering about other diagnoses, go look for other first-party accounts so they can provide the most accurate information. And if I do make a mistake about another diagnosis and you have it, please let me know and I'll try to fix it. I'm not going to go over the symptoms of avoidant personality disorder. Watch my first video, so this one isn't too long if you'd like to hear more about that. But if you're watching this, I assume you probably are somewhat familiar. So the first thing before any specific diagnoses is to rule out any situational issues that are causing you anxiety. So if you have a learning disability like dyslexia that you don't realize you have, or if you're hard of hearing and you don't really realize it, if you have substance abuse problems, eating disorders, physical disabilities, or if you have a job that's a very bad fit for you, if there's an event that just went very poorly, or if you are in a negative relationship of someone that criticizes you a whole lot. These are all things that can cause you to feel super anxious, especially socially anxious, and feel like you have a fear of judgment or criticism from other people. And that can make you think you have avoidant personality disorder when in fact just something in your life is making you feel like shit right now. So the best way to figure this out is to try to think, if you're an adult, have you felt like this for your whole life, or is it a more new thing? And so try to narrow it down and figure out if you have any of these issues. So assuming you have determined it's not that and you have a very ongoing issue like I do, the first thing I want to talk about is social anxiety disorder. So social anxiety disorder, in my opinion, is just sort of part of avoidant personality disorder. Some people say they're not as socially anxious that have avoidant personality disorder, and it's more general anxiety. But to me, it's a key feature of the avoidance that you have the social anxiety disorder. But you can also have social anxiety disorder and not have AvPD. So how do you tell the difference? So for me, the most important question is your anxiety specifically based on a fear of judgment or criticism from other people? And that could be AvPD. But maybe it's not that. Maybe you feel like you have a hard time relating to other people and understanding their thought processes, and conversations are just weird for you. Or maybe you just really don't like interacting with other people. And people with AvPD usually do like interacting with other people at some level. And to figure that out, because, usually I often feel like I don't like interacting with other people, but if I sit down and think about it, I definitely have had good experiences that I would like to have more of from interacting with other people. And there are other diagnoses where that may not be the case. So think about, have you ever had any good social interactions? To what extent, right? So for me, it's obvious I do like them. It's just I tend to avoid them because of my very extreme anxiety. They usually go poorly, but I do want them because I know there is something good there. If that's not the case, you might have social anxiety disorder as well as something else. So I was diagnosed with social anxiety disorder 4 years before AvPD, and when I learned about AvPD, the other symptoms fit perfectly, and I realized that it wasn't just social anxiety disorder. However, you definitely can be diagnosed with both at the same time. So the next thing to go over would be autism. So I did wonder if I was autistic before I learned about avoidant personality disorder. And part of the reason for that is because it's much more widely known. I think the rarity is similar. They're about 2.3% of the population for both autism and AvPD. But autism is much more widely known, mostly because I think of activism. Autistic people are better at being their own activists and having people that would be activists for them, whereas avoidant personality disorder people, we don't really want to go out and talk about it, and we don't talk to other people about it much either. I'm trying to change that for myself a bit with these videos to try to help people out that might have the same problem, but it's very difficult. So anyway, all that is to say, I did hear about autism, obviously, and so I wondered if I had it. So there's some similarities that you might see between autism and AvPD, which are that you might have difficulties in social interactions, you might have differences in communication, high or low sensitivity to sensory input, and you might have restricted or limited interests, right? And there are other autism symptoms that are not part of AvPD at all. But the thing about autism is that it's a spectrum, and you can have a variety of the symptoms. You don't have to have all of them, and you can have them to different degrees. So you could just have these symptoms and think you have autism when it might be AvPD. So to me, the way to tell the difference is root causes. So AvPD people have difficulty in social interaction because they're always hyper-analyzing other people. You're always wondering what they think and assuming you can tell with limited information what they do think based on their body language or brief remarks, and you tend to think that they think of you negatively, and you tend to react poorly to that. Whereas people with autism might have problems in social interactions because they tend to take people literally when they're not being literal, or they have a difficulty understanding typical social cues that people might see. People are trying to suggest you change the conversation, right? And someone with autism might not understand that you're suggesting that unless you just say that. Whereas someone with avoidant personality disorder might assume that you mean that far before you actually intended to even suggest that you meant it. So then there's the communication differences. So AvPD people might feel that they communicate poorly because they're paying so much attention to their own mistakes. So they might, oh my God, I shared too much information there. I should not have disagreed with him. I pronounced that word wrong, or anything else. And you'll have physical symptoms usually like shaking, and that makes you embarrassed and it makes your voice go weird. And right, so you have difficulty with communication, and you can see people reacting to it sometimes, or at least you think you can. Whereas people with autism might have a whole variety of communication differences, which could include people perceiving them as not being good at having a back and forth conversation. They might not think that they're good at listening and responding to what people are saying. They're just kind of talking at them. They might be more willing to talk about their own interests than something else, whereas someone with avoidant personality disorder will probably talk about whatever you want to the extent that they have to talk to you because they don't want to be awkward or weird about it. And people with autism might be seen as sounding too formal rather than casual when it's the case that they should sound like that. And people with AvPD might worry about something like that, and it might be the case for them too, to an extent, but it's probably more common with autism. About interests, people with autism might focus on super specific interests just because they really like those interests. People with avoidant personality disorder might focus on super specific interests just because they have to have something to occupy them, and they're too anxious and depressed to pursue other interests that they might otherwise have. So I thought I might be autistic because I felt like I was misunderstanding social cues, and I was bad at talking to people in a way that made them feel comfortable. I was very picky and focused with what I enjoyed. But once I learned about AvPD, I realized that I was reading into social cues more than average rather than less, which an autistic person might do. And I was either not actually making people uncomfortable and I was just perceiving it that way, or I was making them uncomfortable because I was uncomfortable because of my physical and vocal manifestations of anxiety. And I was super focused on specific interests just because I was too anxious and depressed to try something else, and I have to focus on something to keep off my anxiety. So with that, I hope you could tell the difference. If you feel like you might have autism or AvPD, hopefully that helps narrow it down a little bit for you. The next thing I wanted to talk about is Inattentive ADD. So this is also somewhat more well-known, but it's also more common than AvPD. But it's largely specific to productivity. So I wondered if I had this at a time where one of my biggest worries was focusing and succeeding with college and employment, and I didn't know why I couldn't do it. And I thought maybe my anxiety stemmed from the fact that I couldn't focus on stuff. So some symptoms I had: I made careless mistakes, I couldn't maintain focus, and I was easily distracted. I failed to complete things that I'm working on. I'm bad at organization. I tend to procrastinate if something's going to require sustained mental effort, and I can be forgetful. So that's probably enough symptoms of ADD to be diagnosed with it, but you can't be diagnosed with something if another diagnosis explains it better. When I learned about AvPD, it became clear that the symptoms I had were caused by my anxiety from the AvPD rather than the inability to focus causing anxiety. So I think the differentiation here is going to require a lot of introspection, and there's not an easy answer. You should perhaps try talking to a therapist or psychologist if you think that might help you, but you really need to figure out if your trouble focusing is causing your anxiety, or if your anxiety is causing your trouble focusing. And once I realized I had AvPD, it was very obvious that my anxiety causes my trouble focusing. So, last bit I want to talk about, which is a large bit, but anyway, is other personality disorders that you might have instead of or with AvPD. So we'll start with another cluster C disorder, which is dependent personality disorder. So I never actually thought I had dependent personality disorder. I learned about it after avoidant personality disorder. But there's some overlap here, and it's fairly common that you are also diagnosed with dependent personality disorder if you have AvPD. I was not, but I did have a fairly high dependence score on my psych exam where I was diagnosed with AvPD, so it wasn't that far off from happening. So some of the symptoms include avoidance of responsibility, fear of abandonment, and oversensitivity to criticism, right? So all AvPD things. However, DPD also includes passive or clingy behavior, low social boundaries, meaning just kind of going along with what people say, and you have an inability to make decisions because you want other people's approval. You want to go along with what they want. You place their needs and opinions above your own, and you don't tend to trust yourself. So the key factor here is, do you feel like you're mentally dependent on others? And this isn't about physical dependence, like I depend on them for my income. It's like mentally, do you feel like you need to hang out with another person and go with their flow to deal with your life? Do you feel like you're prone to being manipulated to try to please other people? And are you bad at recognizing your own wants and needs? And so these might be key factors that suggest you have DPD, which again, doesn't preclude you from also having AvPD, but it's good to know if you have both, or maybe you just have DPD. So then there's the non-cluster C disorders. So AvPD has very little similarity to any cluster Bs, the dramatic personality disorders. There's some slight, sometimes occasional variable similarities with BPD, but I don't think they're close enough that you would confuse them. However, I do think all of the cluster A or odd personality disorders could be confused with AvPD if you're really not sure about them. And I think these clusters could be improved a little bit, potentially, but in any case, the one it might have the most similarities with is schizoid personality disorder, which is called either SPD or SZPD. We'll call it SZPD just so we don't confuse it with something else in a minute. I did wonder for a time before I learned about avoidant personality disorder whether I had SZPD. And it can include distinct uncomfortability of interactions with others, and especially close interactions. You can be an unassertive person. You can feel inferior to other people. You can fantasize a lot. And you can sort of feel like you alternate between eloquence and inarticulateness, which is to say, sometimes you speak like a nerd and sometimes you speak like a dumbass, which I definitely do that. And all of these other things, I feel I can relate to all of these symptoms. So I did wonder if this was my deal for a time. However, it can also include more specific and unique symptoms, including what people might see as atypical moral or political beliefs or tendencies towards spirituality and mysticism and things like that. So the key for me in finding out that SZPD didn't fit was how I feel towards other people, because SZPD people may be highly sensitive and curious about other people and wanting to appreciate relationships. However, even if they do want these things, they might have a hard time actually enjoying them in practice. They might not really enjoy social interactions. They might just want to enjoy social interactions because they can see that they're missing out on something, but they don't really enjoy them in practice. Whereas I think most AvPD people, or at least myself, again, I can only really speak for myself, do tend to enjoy some social interactions, and it's just we have a lot of difficulties with them that may sometimes make us think that we don't, but in practice we know that there are times that we have. So I think that's the key to figuring out the difference between these two, but there's a good reason that psychologists have even confused the two of them and wondered if they could be the same thing. After learning about them, I'm confident I have AvPD and not SZPD, but I cannot speak for people with SZPD, so I would again reiterate that you should do more research and listen to first-party accounts from people with that disorder if you're wondering if that could really be what you're dealing with or not. The next thing is to say that AvPD does have strong intersections with paranoid personality disorder, or PPD. So the AvPD hypersensitive subtype that I do have very strongly intensely features paranoid tendencies. And the psych test that I took that diagnosed me with AvPD also gave me a high paranoid score, but again, not enough to diagnose me with PPD. But again, this is something you can be diagnosed with both, and it's certainly quite common. So some of the symptoms you might confuse are being hypersensitive, easily insulted, vigilantly scanning of your environment for suggestions that might validate fears or biases you have. You might feel like you're in danger and look for signs or threats of trouble. And you're not necessarily going to appreciate if there's evidence offered to you or an alternative interpretation that suggests that you're wrong to be paranoid about what you're paranoid about. So I think there can be a couple distinctions here. If you're more paranoid for your safety rather than your comfort, you might have PPD rather than AvPD, or in addition to it if the symptoms of AvPD also apply. So I have slightly above average general paranoia, such as triple checking that a door is locked and still not believing that it is after I do that. But it's also not nearly to an extent that it interferes with my functioning like my AvPD symptoms do. And my paranoia is generally about other people and what they're thinking or saying, and is over concerned for my self-esteem, just feeling comfortable rather than actual physical safety. And I think if you have more pervasive paranoia, that might be PPD instead of or in addition to AvPD. So again, pay attention to the specific symptoms of these two that don't overlap, and that'll help you figure it out. And the last thing I want to talk about is schizotypal personality disorder, which again is either SPD or STPD. So we'll call it STPD so that it's not the same abbreviation. So this can include behavior that's off-putting to others. It can include paranoid social anxiety and depression. So again, all things you'd see with AvPD. And you could confuse it with that or just anxiety and depression. You may not realize that it's anything more specific than that. However, it may also include strange or manners that people think are random of your thoughts or your speech or your dress. You might have beliefs that people think are unconventional or that tend to be paranormal or superstitious. You could also suffer from psychosis or derealization. And people with STPD may interpret normal situations as being strange or somehow being special and unique to them, not believing in coincidences, that sort of thing. I think this is probably the most complicated personality disorder, and since I don't have it, I don't want to talk about it too much. I don't want to contradict anything because it's a very specific sort of thing, and I don't want to give out wrong information about it. But I think it is important to say that you might have STPD and have anxiety symptoms that resemble AvPD, and if you think you've had experiences that make other people see you as unusual rather than just awkward, you might want to look into first-person accounts of people that have STPD and see what they say about it and see if you can relate to them more than you can relate to me in my first video, for example, or perhaps both. I don't think there's a huge comorbidity between these two personality disorders, but I'm not sure that it's impossible either. So that's all I wanted to talk about in this video. I hope mostly that it was a fairly concise way of helping you figure out if maybe you relate some to AvPD, some to autism, and you're just not quite sure what the differences are based on the fairly general symptoms. And I hope this direct comparison might make it a little easier for you to figure out. You still need to listen to first-party accounts from people that have these things and try to figure out who you can relate to the most. But I think that's at least a decent list of the things you might confuse it with and why you might confuse it and how you might be able to figure out which one it is or whether it's more than one issue. So yeah, that's all for today, and I'll be back with another sort of video soon. Thanks.